This series is based upon and inspired by the 2021 series Squid Game, created by Hwang Dong-hyuk and produced by Netflix. It also features art created by the fabulous Andrew MacLaine. Yusuf, player 28, peeks out from behind the tree. He sees nothing out of the ordinary and slowly gets back up, being careful to avoid stinging himself on the nettles without slipping into the ravine. A bullet is then fired in his direction. Yusuf's arm is grazed by the bullet and he yells in pain. He tries to grip onto the tree but stumbles and falls down the side of the ravine, landing on Mrs. Blue. For the last minute, she has been nursing a bullet wound to her shoulder, hidden next to a small tree which juts out near the top of the ravine. However, before either Yusuf or Mrs. Blue appear to realise what has just happened, they both tumble several metres further into the ravine. As Mr. Orange's grunts are heard crashing across the higher ground, Yusuf and Mrs. Blue land within some rocks and sticks at the base of the ravine. The latter winces and quietly growls that she was hiding from those two psychopaths. Still catching his breath, Yusuf looks down to Mrs. Blue's bleeding shoulder and gasps in shock. They then hear Miss Green on the ground above, telling Mr. Orange that she saw her hiding in these nettles. Miss Green shouts to Mrs. Blue to come out, as they just want to talk to her. Down in the ravine, Yusuf raises a finger to his lips and shakes his head at Mrs. Blue. She breathes out in shaky fear when Yusuf looks back and notices a large muddy rock jutting out beneath the unearthed roots of a tree. As Yusuf gets up and hurries to hide beneath this rock, Mrs. Blue remains still and grips her shoulder. Yet upon hearing Miss Green's frustrated calls from the top of the ravine, she gasps in pain and lumbers after Yusuf. She collapses next to him and lets out a dolorous hum, although he snarls at her to stay quiet and keep her head down. Mrs. Blue jerks her head towards Yusuf and is about to say something when Miss Green is heard saying that they need to check down this hill thing. Yusuf crouches down behind the rock so that he is less likely to be seen from the top of the ravine. He then pulls Mrs. Blue closer by her jumpsuit. Even though this appears to cause her some pain, she does not complain and remains hidden from above. As Mr. Orange's footsteps are heard crunching across the ground at the top of the ravine, Yusuf holds his breath and Mrs. Blue covers her mouth. They remain still for almost 10 seconds, until Mr. Orange loudly inhales and asks Miss Green if she is certain she saw Blue come this way. Miss Green yells that she already told him she did, but the old battle-axe must have run ahead to the beach. Yusuf and Mrs. Blue hear Miss Green gasp, and Mr. Orange shouts to never raise her voice at him like this again. A silence follows. Then he jokes how Blue won't make it very far, as he shot her twice. Miss Green replies how he had better be right, and claims she said this was a bad idea. Over the next few seconds, their squabbling voices travel away to the south, across the higher ground. Once they are out of earshot, Mrs. Blue breathes a sigh of relief. Yusuf mutters, "Fuck this," and comes out from behind the rock. He is about to run on through the ravine when Mrs. Blue feebly asks for help. Yusuf looks back, and Mrs. Blue gestures to her shoulder wound, but he shakes his head and asks why he would help someone who has done this, which he says as he gestures to the forest around him. Yusuf begins to run on, when Mrs. Blue calls out that she has access to a boat. He stops and turns back once more, clearly agitated. Mrs. Blue seethes in pain and rises to her feet, explaining how she and the other Triangle guards were given keys to an emergency boat. She pulls out a ring of keys from her jumpsuit and promises to help Yusuf escape, adding that they both need to get off this island right now. Yusuf shakes his head in disbelief until Mrs. Blue pleads that she had absolutely no idea what she was getting herself into. A gunshot and joyous hoot sound to the south, and Yusuf growls how she had better not be lying. He practically yanks Mrs. Blue up from the ground and snatches the keys from her hand. She looks ready to object, but before she could speak, Yusuf pulls her on through the meandering ravine, and soon she is able to maintain a slow jog, despite the pain in her shoulder. As they turn a waterlogged corner, Yusuf asks Mrs. Blue why she is running from the other guards, although she fires back that she could ask him the same thing. Yusuf says nothing and continues breathing heavily for the next 2 minutes as he leads the way, with Mr. Orange and Miss Green's occasional shouts heard only faintly in the distance. When Yusuf and Mrs. Blue are within 40 metres of the beach, the former runs around a sharp bend of the ravine, where he is met by a steep, dry incline, littered with a plethora of fallen trees. Mrs. Blue gasps in despair and grips onto her now aching shoulder, complaining with a tearful voice how she cannot move any further. Yet Yusuf grabs her other arm and orders that she will take him to the boat even if it's the last thing she does. As Yusuf helps Mrs. Blue climb over the first of the fallen trees, he hears another gunshot to the west. He halts in his tracks and asks where Mrs. Blue's gun is, to which she replies that she dropped it. Yusuf shakes his head and continues to help her over the trees, but grumbles how stupid this was. Mrs. Blue stops and shouts that she did not exactly plan to be in these circumstances, fleeing for her life with a bearded Asian chap. However, life will sometimes take a shirt on your hopes and dreams. Yusuf shouts at Mrs. Blue to shut up and hurry. Then he begins to help her up the final stretch of the leaf-littered hill. They maneuver their way over another fallen tree when a loud rustling of leaves is heard at the top of the hill. Yusuf and Mrs. Blue both freeze as Miss Green appears at the top of the hill. Mrs. Blue gasps and turns to run away, but Miss Green runs straight down the hill towards her. Miss Green pounces and tackles Mrs. Blue to the ground. Yusuf falls forward and looks back in shock to see Miss Green roar and punch Mrs. Blue across the face. Mrs. Blue tries to defend herself, yet Miss Green wastes no time in strangling her by the throat. While Mrs. Blue gasps for air, Yusuf watches aghast. He jolts to the side and spends a few seconds ripping off a branch from a rotted tree. He finally pulls it free, then scurries towards Miss Green. However, before Yusuf reaches Miss Green, she hears him approaching and quickly removes a hand from Mrs. Blue's throat. She takes out her gun and shouts to fuck off, then fires it at Yusuf's head. He flinches, but no bullet leaves the gun. Miss Green swears, and Mrs. Blue punches her in the stomach from beneath. Miss Green shouts in pain and falls back, then the women violently grapple upon the ground, causing a small storm of flying leaves. Yusuf shudders in disbelief, then gets up and sprints over the top of the hill without looking back. A moment later, Mr. Orange arrives at the base of this hill and watches from behind an oak tree to see Mrs. Blue getting the upper hand over Miss Green. Mrs. Blue punches Miss Green several times in the face, until Miss Green finally manages to free one of her hands before jabbing a thumb into Mrs. Blue's shoulder wound. Mrs. Blue shrieks and falls back, gripping onto her wound. Gushing in pain, she tries to stumble back up when Mr. Orange runs over and tackles her from behind. Mrs. Blue screams and calls for help, but Mr. Orange forcefully grips the back of her neck, then shoots a bullet into the back of her head. Mrs. Blue falls forward onto Miss Green, who gasps and shoves her body away. Miss Green berates Mr. Orange for taking his time, to which he moodily responds that she should be thanking him for saving her life. Miss Green sighs and impatiently asks for Mr. Orange's gun. He hesitantly asks why, but she snatches it from out of his hand, then shoots Mrs. Blue twice through the back. Mr. Orange asks if Miss Green did this to make sure she's dead. Miss Green shakes her head and replies, no, because she was a duckhead. Mr. Orange gives an accepting nod of the head, and Miss Green stands over the corpse. She is then heard gathering spit in her mouth, but appears to forget she's wearing a mask. Following the resulting sound of disgust from Miss Green, Mr. Orange hides a chuckle. Miss Green seems ready to react when Mr. Orange blurts out, "The camera!" Miss Green leans down and carelessly flips over Mrs. Blue's body. She unzips her jumpsuit, yet all that lies beneath is a black t-shirt and blue tights, with no sign of a camera. Miss Green swears, but Mr. Orange reassures that she must have dropped it, like she did with the radio. Miss Green looks to him and urges how they need to find it. However, Mr. Orange points towards the beach and responds that first of all, they need to sort this one, then they can look for the camera. After hearing the shot that kills Mrs. Blue, Yusuf speeds even faster through the thick forest until he spots the sandy beach beyond the tree line. A smile appears on his face, and despite clearly being exhausted at this point, he runs on. Yusuf slips on a dampened pocket of moss and slides past a few trees, landing on the beach. He then looks ahead, and his expression of relief swiftly turns to wide-eyed horror. The outline of the nearest land sits across the sea, with buildings, trees, and even some moving cars visible. However, it is at least a mile away. Yusuf's breathing accelerates, and he whispers to himself, "No more than a few 100 meters?" He curses Nicholas several times, and kicks Subsan in anger until Miss Green's voice sounds in the forest behind. He gasps, takes a deep breath, and turns back to the sea. Yusuf looks both ways across the beach, and notices that to his left, the land is slightly closer. In a panic, he scurries in this direction, but is too focused on the water to notice Miss Green and Mr. Orange appear at the edge of the forest behind him. Within seconds, they spot Yusuf running away to the left, and Miss Green calmly tells Mr. Orange to take a shot. After making sure his gun is loaded, Mr. Orange kneels down, lines up his aim towards Yusuf, and pulls the trigger. The resulting shot fires through the side of Yusuf's jacket, but avoids his body. He jumps and yells in a frenzy as he looks back to see the guards. Mr. Orange insists he's genuinely a better shot than what he is showing. Miss Green sniggers and watches from a distance to see Yusuf darting straight into the water and shivering from its chill. Despite the temperature, he forces himself to wade forcefully ahead. When his shoulders are submerged, he glances back to see Mr. Orange and Miss Green strolling across the beach towards him. After a desperate, yet hopeful breath, Yusuf plunges forward into the water and proceeds to swim beneath the surface, away from the beach, for as long as possible, although this is made difficult by the motion of the sea's waves beneath the surface. Nearly 30 seconds go by, and Yusuf comes up from the water, gasping for air. He takes another deep breath and is about to submerge himself again when he glances back to see the guards, now stood at the edge of the beach. Yusuf gasps and descends into the water once more. He takes a few strokes forward, then suddenly lets out his breath. Coming up to the surface, he splutters water from his mouth, and when he is able to breathe again, he painfully grips his scapula. He turns in a daze to see a trail of red water flowing behind him. He looks up to the beach and sees the gun held out in Mr. Orange's hand. Struggling to kick beneath the waves, Yusuf is barely able to stay afloat. He cries out to the guards to leave him alone, which causes more water to enter his mouth. He coughs out, turns forward again, and winces in pain as he forces his legs to kick onwards. A second later, another shot sounds from the beach. Yusuf yells in agony and sinks beneath the surface as his left leg starts bleeding into the sea. He grits his teeth and frantically kicks with his right leg. He somehow makes it back to the surface and starts to take sporadic strokes forward. For the next minute, he is merely thrashing the right side of his body within the water, desperately attempting to stay afloat, until a hand grips onto the back of his neck. Finally still, Yusuf turns his mouth above the water and begs that he wants to go home. Mr. Orange snarls and dunks Yusuf into the water by his neck, then shoots a bullet into the back of his head. Mr. Orange lets out a sigh of relief and watches for a few seconds as Yusuf's body floats serenely upon the water's surface, only moving with the ebb and flow of the water. After a while, Miss Green asks from the shore if this player is dead, and Mr. Orange gives a thumbs up. He grips onto Yusuf's neck again and pulls him back through the water towards the shore. Once Yusuf's body is brought ashore, Mr. Orange sits upon the sand and announces that he needs a rest. Miss Green takes out her radio, but Mr. Orange tells her to wait. She pauses, and Mr. Orange seems to ponder for a few seconds, before taking out his own radio and reporting an incident in the south of the arena. He tells Miss Green to hand over her gun, but she interrupts, frantically asking why he is telling them what has happened. He responds that it will look a bit fucking fishy if they are caught down here with the bodies of that cow and this one nearby. Miss Green leans back defensively, and Mr. Orange asks if she thinks she has the noggin to talk her way out of this situation. She fails to answer, and Mr. Orange orders her to hand over her gun. He proceeds to bury this empty gun within the sand. Miss Green asks why he's doing this, to which he briskly replies, "Loose ends." Without hesitation, Mr. Orange takes out his own gun and wipes it clean with a tissue from his pocket. He proceeds to grip it in Yusuf's hand, then nestles it within a pocket of Yusuf's jacket. The static of the radio screeches, causing Miss Green to jump. The voice of Square Guard subsequently replies through the radio, asking what has happened. Mr. Orange states that Mrs. Blue is dead, but he has just shot and killed the player who killed her. Miss Green turns to Orange, and the radio falls quiet. Yet after a few seconds of silence, Square Guard acknowledges this news. He confirms a few more details about their location, then assures that all finished circle guards are being sent down to them. The transmission ends, and Mr. Orange states how lucky Miss Green is that he has her back. She says nothing and looks out across the sea, before asking what the hell they are doing with these people. A few minutes earlier, it was announced that player 23 has passed this game. Diane, player 96, holds back from taking a turn and asks with a hopeful tone if this is Alan. Mary, player 95, exhales and answers no idea, then tells Diane to take her shot. Their game continues, with Mary down to her third and final conker, while Diane is still using her second. When it is announced that 15 minutes of this game remain, play returns to Mary once more. For her first two shots, she manages to hit Diane's conker, but without enough force to cause any cracks. Mary is about to take her third shot when a cold wind blows in through the trees. She remains still, keeping her conker from striking forward, and a thoughtful smile forms across her face. When the wind subsides a few seconds later, Diane asks if Mary is not going to take her turn, to which she bluntly replies that she does not want to do this anymore. Diane frowns and asks if she's giving up. Mary shakes her head, and with a slight giggle, answers how she does not want to waste the last 10 minutes of her life playing a game she doesn't like. Diane warily says Mary's name, but seems unsure of what else to say, until a shot and cry are heard in the distance. As she inhales with concern, it is announced that player 87, the middle-aged woman with unbalanced eyes, is eliminated, whilst player 148, Lakshmi, has passed this game. Diane lets out a sigh of relief, and Mary reassures how he is still alive. Diane asks who she's talking about, but Mary faces her with a very knowing look. Diane opens her mouth, but fails to speak. Mary says she heard they shared a kiss last night. Diane turns to the nearest tree, and Mary chuckles how she would not have predicted this a few days ago. She jokes that she was waiting for Diane to admit how she felt about Steve, player 98. However, Diane immediately asks in return what good it would do to discuss how she feels about him, as they will not exactly be able to have a happily ever fucking after. Mary calmly affirms that even if this is true, it's always good to talk about how we feel. She then explains how having to leave the army was bad enough, but having nobody to talk to caused her mental health to suffer even further. Diane frowns and asks if Mary is a mental person. Mary blankly replies that she isn't mentally ill, if this is what Diane is asking, although on the outside, she has sometimes felt lonely. As Diane squints in confusion, Mary smiles to her, and declares how it is nice to talk to a friend for once. Diane rolls her eyes, and asks if Mary has any friendly suggestions of where to send her and Steve for their first date. Drinks in a bulldog pit, dinner on a slippery climbing frame, a romp in that dormitory where everyone could fucking watch. Mary's face falls, as she turns to sit on the dry earth. Diane looks back and breathes out with regret. She walks over and sits next to Mary, who gives a subtle side-eye in return. Diane puts out a hand and apologizes that it was she who was being a silly cow this time. Still turning away and with emotion forming in her voice, Mary claims Diane and Steve are the closest thing she has had to friends since she left the army. Diane smiles pensively, and after a long pause, asks if she and Mary would have been friends in the outside world. Mary quickly responds, no. Diane seems taken aback, yet slightly amused by the speed of this answer. With a sullen smile, Mary proceeds to explain how they lived completely different lives. Diane concedes that this is true, but Mary interrupts, flippantly asking what it even means to be friends with someone. Diane shrugs with a smirk, and responds how now she thinks about it, she has hardly thought about any of hers from home since she got here. Mary turns, and asks with surprise if Diane has friends on the outside. She turns with an annoyed look to Mary, who shoots back with a knowing grin. Diane sniggers and looks away, then a distant flurry of shots follows. It is announced that player 130, the woman with an aged face and wispy black hair, has been eliminated, whilst player 200, the young woman with a short auburn perm, has passed this game. On the opposite eastern side of the forest, Steve and Mike, player 107, are down to their last conkers. With both men now somewhat fatigued, play passes to Steve, who takes 2 careful shots at Mike's conker, although it remains uncracked. He grits his teeth and pulls back his conker as far as possible for the final shot, then lets it fly forwards. Mike's conker remains intact. Steve lets out a sigh and turns to run a hand through his hair. The guard states that play passes to Mike, who is already preparing his conker for its first shot. Steve warily turns back and allows his conker to dangle by its string. As Mike focuses, Steve tightens his grip on the string. Mike pulls his conker back even further, and Steve winces uncomfortably. Mike jolts forward, but he purposefully holds back his conker, stopping it from swinging forward. Steve shudders and begins to inquire what's happening, when Mike smacks his conker forward for real. Steve's conker is hit with great force, although he is holding onto the string just tightly enough that it does not fall to the ground. Mike lets out a nervous chuckle and mutters that he had to try something. Steve grips even tighter to his string as Mike prepares for his second shot. Steve looks down to the ground and avoids eye contact. He subtly grips as his conker is hit, with enough force for it to spin several times around his wrist. He shudders and appears shaken when the conker smacks into his knuckles. He begins to unwrap it from around his fingers when Mike urges him to hurry as the clock is ticking. Steve looks surprised by Mike's tone, but he does as asked and leaves his conker to dangle once more. Mike then pulls back his conker, and any emotion present in his face drains away as he eyes his target. He holds his conker, ready to strike with all the strength in his contracted muscles. Steve watches for a few seconds, and with a dull demeanor, his eyes slowly close. A moment later, Steve's conker is hit with a loud crack, and Mike lets out a low-pitched, dragging chuckle. Still with closed eyes, an expression of sorrowful disgust forms upon Steve's face, and Mike says he probably wishes he chose a different opponent. Steve timidly opens one eye and sees that his conker is still attached to the string, but it now features a large crack running almost all the way across its upper half. Mike lets out a weak grin, and he fails to look Steve in the eye. The guard informs that play now passes to Steve. After letting his own conker dangle, Mike jokes how he should have chosen that loony bitch with the tattoos, who sat next to him on the journey here. Steve does not reply, and readies his first shot. Mike then says that either of them could have chosen the blind girl and got through. This causes Steve to exhale hoarsely through his nose, although he remains silent and smacks his conker down. This shot is, however, inaccurate, and only hits the side of Mike's conker. While Steve pulls back his conker for its second shot, Mike quickly states that it would have been even easier for either of them to beat that fussy bird who Steve was boffing last night. Mike gives a knowing grin as Steve looks into his eyes with an irritable glare. He then smacks his conker down onto Mike's, resulting in a loud crack. Steve grits his teeth and tells Mike to keep Diane and Mary out of it. He readies his conker, but Mike smiles and casually states that one of them could be dead already. Steve sighs and pulls back his conker. He responds that neither of the girls' numbers have been called yet. He is about to take his shot when Mike blurts out how either way, one of them is about to die. Steve simmers and his hands form into fists. Mike looks back with a calm smile until Steve's conker comes flying down for its third shot. A piercing crack sounds, followed by a distinct clatter against the stone ground. Mike gasps, and Steve hums in confusion as they and their guard look down to see what appears to be two conkers rolling into a narrow crevice of the nearest rock. The guard grips onto her gun and walks forward to inspect these conkers, which have come to a stop in this crevice. Whilst Mike anxiously asks what they should do now, Steve looks down to his own string and frowns before raising it up to his eyes. It is then that through the sunlight he sees a small chunk from the top half of his final conker still attached to its string. A minute yet hopeful smile forms upon Steve's face. The guard looks back and is about to answer Mike's question when she notices Steve holding the remnant of his conker upon the string. A second later, Mike also looks over to Steve. Almost immediately, he insists that this does not count, as most of the conker is gone. Steve quietly yet firmly replies how it's still a conker. The guard silently turns a gun towards Mike, who backs away, frantically protesting for his life. Steve watches on in shock as the guard turns off the gun's safety. In clear distress, Mike pleads with Steve to help him, adding that he did not mean what he said about the girls and was only trying to get a rise from him for the sake of the game. Steve says nothing and looks to the sky. Mike gasps and swears as he turns to run away over some slanting rocks. Seconds later, he is shot through the back and falls with a heavy thud against the rocks. Steve closes his eyes and his fingers shake. The guard whispers into the radio, and a few seconds later, it is announced that player 107 is eliminated, whilst player 98 has passed this game. Steve feels his hands through his hair and watches on in silence until the guard reassures that it's over now and orders him to come back with her to the clearing. Whilst they walk away, it is announced that only 5 minutes of the game now remain. Beneath an oak tree in the western forest, Diane and Mary are still talking about their lives over the past few years when it is suddenly announced that player 107, Mike, is eliminated. Diane waits with bated breath until it is also announced that player 98, Steve, has passed this game. She exhales in relief, and Mary takes her hand, joyfully saying how he is still alive. Diane smiles and looks to see the slightly hopeful expression on Mary's face. A quiet few seconds go by, then Diane asks what the other thing was that Mary said she lost last summer. Mary frowns, and Diane clarifies how at the party yesterday she said that her sight was not the only thing she lost when she left the army. Mary looks back ahead and lets out a calm smile, then responds that his name was Simon. Diane appears surprised, but Mary explains how they became involved when they were stationed together just outside London. However, last June, they were informed that they were going to be redeployed to Northern Ireland the next week. With a stoic tone, Mary recounts how after hearing this news, Simon told her of his intention to go AWOL, as he heard about how dangerous Northern Ireland was. He asked if Mary would run away with him that night. Mary lets out a sharp breath, and recounts how Simon begged her to run away with him, while she did everything she could to convince him to stay, which resulted in a big fight between them. While Mary runs her hand across the grass, Diane asks if he came with her. She shakes her head, and responds how later that night, Simon disappeared, then a week later, she was in Belfast. After taking in a quiet breath, Mary reveals how she never spoke to him again. Diane squints, and asks if she ever wishes she did run away with him. Mary shakes her head, and answers not once. In a stoic manner, she reasons that even though she will never know what her life would look like now if she had chosen to run away with Simon, she is pleased she made the choice she did. Diane gives a bittersweet frown, and Mary concedes how this may sound strange, given where they are, but the shoulda woulda coulda attitude is no way to live. It is then announced that 3 minutes remain. Diane exhales, and unwillingly asks if they should end their game. Mary nods, and asks whose turn it is. The women stand back up in position, and the guard answers that it is player 95's turn. Mary raises her final conker, and is about to take her shot against Diane's second conker, which now has several cracks. Mary gives a determined glare, then takes in a deep breath, before turning and throwing her conker as far as she can into the puddle-filled tree line behind her. A distant squelch is heard, and Diane gasps, asking what she has just done. Mary looks back, and with a smile utters, "I was never going to win, you silly cow." The guard seems unsure of what to do, but watches Mary as she calmly returns to sit beneath the oak tree. Diane seems lost for words, until a shot is heard nearby, followed by a distressed wail. It is subsequently announced that player 197, Scott, is eliminated, whilst player 189, Kelly, has passed. Mary stares ahead, and Diane approaches, apologising for being a callous bitch when they met. She sits down next to Mary and continues to express her regrets, although Mary holds up a hand in objection and orders her to stop this pity party. Diane seems lost for words, although Mary takes her hand and firmly tells her to buck up and do whatever she can to win this shirt. With a determined expression, Mary adds how she is not dying for nothing. She then asks if Diane understands. In a daze, she hesitantly mutters that she does. Mary's expression relaxes, and she jokes that when they first met, she would have been furious to hear how some blonde bimbo who reeked of cheap perfume would knock her out, but she wouldn't have done what she just did if this bimbo didn't have what it took to win. Diane tries to smile, but a tear forms in her eye. Mary winks in her direction, then lets out a deep sigh. The guard turns back and deactivates the safety to her gun as she walks towards the grassy bank on which the women are still sat. Mary calmly tells Diane that she doesn't need to be here for what is about to happen. However, Diane affirms how she will stay with her. Diane takes Mary's hand, and she manages a small smile. As the guard approaches, Mary states, "A romp in the dormitory." Diane looks confused, until Mary explains that this would be the best first date she and Steve could have out of the earlier suggestions. With a tear now falling from her eye, Diane chuckles, and Mary declares, "Fuck what anyone else thinks," and to make the most of whatever time they have left. The guard stops within some crunchy leaves a few meters before them. Diane looks to the guard with disdain, and finds herself gripping tighter onto Mary's hand, although Mary reassures that she is not afraid, never has been, never will be. She looks up to the guard and says she's ready. The guard raises the gun towards Mary's head, and Diane cowers. With a confident tone, Mary tells the guard to shoot, but the guard remains still, seemingly unsure if she should follow this order. Mary tightens her grip on Diane's hand, and her breathing accelerates until a tear suddenly falls from her eye, and she screams at the guard to shoot her. A bullet fires from the gun, and Mary's head is thrown back against the tree, gushing blood as breath escapes from her open mouth. Diane yelps in horror and scrambles away from Mary's body until she backs into another tree. She scarpers up from the ground and looks ready to charge at the guard. However, the guard firmly holds out her gun and reminds Diane that her friend just died so that she could have a chance of winning. Diane glares at the guard and breathes in, then finds herself gripping faintly onto the nearest tree. A moment later, it is announced through the speakers that player 95 is eliminated, whilst player 96 has passed this game. 10 minutes later, in the azure-lit dormitory, most of the remaining players are resting on their beds or helping themselves to the provided brunch bags. Asleep in his bed, Alan is shuffling and sniffing, with sweat glistening across his face against the light from above. After muttering uneasily, he jerks awake and looks around in a daze, with his dampened hair on edge. Alan grips into the newly made, yet grubby sheets of his bed, and composes himself. He gradually turns to Tracy, player 26, who watches him from her bed as she munches on a grilled tomato. The pair make eye contact, but say nothing. Alan then turns to the front screen, which displays the prize fund of £13,500,000 with 17 players remaining. After a few seconds, he whispers the amount to himself before coughing out phlegm from deep in his lungs. Tracy watches as Alan holds his duvet to his mouth. When he appears to have regained his breath, she informs that he has a packet of tissues. Alan looks towards Tracy and still seems dazed, but she nods to the pack at the end of his bed. Whilst Alan clears his nose with these tissues, Mr. Orange walks over from the front platform and stops by the bed of Richard, player 14, who is awakening in his bed and feeling his newly trimmed hair. Alan gulps from his water bottle, letting some liquid slide down his chin. He then asks what time it is, and Tracy does not answer, but comes over to sit upon the next bed. She asks what happened to Yusuf, and Alan looks round to his bed. He seems unsure of how to answer, and remains silent until Tracy asks if he gave a good game. Alan hesitates and answers that you could say this. However, before he can go into more detail, Mr. Orange marches in and orders him to go and take a shower. Alan looks up in surprise, but says nothing. Mr. Orange grabs the towel from the foot of the bed, and after looking down at Alan's bed sheets, claims he is currently swimming in his own sweat. With an emotionless gaze, Tracy eats the rest of her tomato and watches Alan get up from his bed. He then heads towards the front of the dormitory, closely escorted by Mr. Orange. Scarcely audible beneath his mask, Mr. Orange advises Alan to think twice about sharing what happened to 28. Alan continues walking and replies that he does not know what happened to Yusuf. Continuing to the front doors, Mr. Orange whispers how 28 drowned whilst attempting to flee the island. Alan comes to a sudden halt and turns, yet Mr. Orange orders to keep moving and points his gun towards Alan's stomach. As Alan stumbles back and walks on, Mr. Orange advises him to keep this information to himself and consider it a warning. When they reach the platform, the front doors swing open and Kelly is escorted through by a circle guard. Alan is captivated by her puffy, tear-stricken eyes until Diane follows through the door, escorted by Mr. Yellow. Alan calls to Diane, but she manages little more than eye contact as she shuffles past. Mr. Yellow pokes the gun into Alan's back and marches him ahead through the front doors. Meanwhile, Diane is escorted through the rows of beds by Mr. Yellow. They pass Tracy, who appears to be asleep in her bed, before continuing on to the middle of the dormitory. Diane's expression remains vacant when she reaches her own bed. She sits down and holds her head in her hands as Mr. Yellow leads Kelly onwards to the back of the dormitory. A few seconds later, Diane looks back up and sees the unmade bed in which Mary slept the night before. She exhales, then turns towards the screen at the front of the dormitory. After observing the statistics, Diane rests her gaze closer and notices Silver, player 71, performing yoga by her bed. Diane seems to become hypnotized by Silver's movements until player 132, the middle-aged man with bushy eyebrows, shouts across to player 127, the older West African man. This noise causes Diane to reanimate, and she notices the brunch pack at the end of her bed. She proceeds to devour a bacon sandwich, and soon focuses on player 53, the middle-aged woman with the blonde quiff and chunky glasses, who is busily talking to Colin, player 37. Diane therefore fails to notice Steve, walking towards her from the far bathroom. He slows as he sees the back of Diane's head, along with Mary's empty bed. He stops and appears morose as he considers how to address Diane, but it is then that she turns round to see him. Steve and Diane look into each other's eyes for a few seconds, and Steve gives a bittersweet smile of acceptance. Diane turns away, and seconds later she begins to cry. Steve walks forward and sits down on the bed with Diane. As he holds her in his arms, she pleads that she is sorry, but he responds how it is not her fault. With a tear falling down her cheek, Diane claims she was so nasty to her when they met. Steve shushes Diane and rubs her back, responding how they were mates yesterday, With a blank expression, Diane simply states that she did not want Mary to die. Steve says he knows and gestures to the nearest guard. He then says how these whoppers deliberately tricked them into competing against their friends. Although this guard is talking to Johnny, player 123, several rows away, he looks back in Steve's direction. Diane admits she has no clue what a whopper is, but warns Steve not to annoy the guards, then reminds him that they have guns. Steve looks into Diane's eyes. She wipes away her tears and states that someone just died for him to be here. He concedes that Diane is correct, then sits back down and puts his arm over her shoulder. While she blankly stares ahead, Steve comments how for someone who could not see, Mary did exceptionally well in these games. Diane nods gently in agreement, and Steve adds how he is sure Mary would have felt some comfort at the end to not be alone. Diane gives a hopeless smile, and another tear falls from her eye as Steve rubs her back. At this moment, Nicholas walks through the door at the far end of the dormitory and surveys the other players. He squints round from right to left until his eye lands on Kelly. Nicholas returns to his bed and subtly watches as player 200 tries to talk to Kelly, although she is now sobbing into her pillow. Nicholas lies down and begins his packet of hash browns before turning to the other corner, in which Charlie, player 191, has just sat up to observe this commotion. The men make eye contact, and Nicholas jokes, "Women, eh?" But Charlie says nothing and gets up from his bed. The enormous frame of Charlie's body approaches, and Nicholas finds himself leaning back. However, Charlie turns away and heads towards Kelly, causing Nicholas to let out a hidden sigh of relief. When Charlie arrives next to Kelly's bed, player 200 looks up to him with an uneasy, pleading expression. He kneels down and simply mutters, "Chin up, love." Kelly slowly glances up to Charlie. He looks at her for a few seconds and says that her man would want her to keep going. Player 200 gestures to Kelly's brunch pack and remarks that she hasn't touched any of her food yet. Charlie looks into the pack and comments how the thing he needs right now is a bowl of Monster Puffs. He then jokes that his 4-year-old son says he looks like the Honey Monster. Kelly manages a reluctant smile, and Charlie growls, "Honey." With a thoughtful smile, he adds how he's feeling a bit monster mad himself in here. Charlie gives Kelly a supportive nod and passes the tissues from her pack. He then shares that his little sister is also a singer. Kelly wipes away her tears and smiles to Charlie, thanking him and player 200. Nicholas turns away from watching this scene, shaking his head in disbelief. For the next few hours, the 17 players are left to their own devices, with most choosing to relax on their beds, chat with each other, or sleep off any remaining hangovers. In the early afternoon, Square Guard requests to meet with the 3 remaining triangle guards in the gallery overlooking the dormitory. Once they are in their assigned seats, Square Guard gives his congratulations for everything they did in this morning's game. He states that they each played a part in organising what was, for the most part, a well-organised game. However, as they could see, one of their numbers failed in this quest. Miss Green grips her hands against her knees, and Square Guard hesitantly informs that Mrs. Blue appeared to misread her map whilst travelling between games. He explains how this caused her to veer off course and run into player 28, who is reported to have escaped his game shortly beforehand. Miss Green turns her head at a curious angle, and Mr. Yellow asks how a player was able to escape from a game. Square Guard firstly assures that the guard responsible for player 28's game has been dealt with. Then he shares how an investigation into this incident is already underway. Miss Green looks across to Mr. Orange, although he does not look back. Square Guard declares that according to the investigation's findings so far, Mrs. Blue was chased south, through the forest, by player 28. With a purposefully slow tone, Square Guard reveals that shortly before she reached the beach, player 28 appears to have caught and killed her. Mr. Yellow then raises his hand and asks what happened to player 28. As Miss Green tenses her gloved hands, Square Guard begins to respond, but Mr. Orange shouts over how he shot this player before he could escape the island. Square Guard impatiently asks Mr. Orange not to interrupt. Mr. Orange lets out a quiet scoff beneath his mask, but Square Guard turns back towards all 3 guards and reiterates how the investigation is still ongoing, and they will be informed of its findings in due course. With an incredulous tone, Mr. Yellow asks why this game had to happen outside, when it could have been played in a secure building. Square Guard claims he is glad Mr. Yellow asked this question. He clears his throat and answers how, at this stage in the process, he wants to see if the 3 of them are able to work under pressure in an unpredictable environment. He explains how the powers that be have already shown their preference for games which feature variety, with new rules, formats, and settings. After a brief pause, he adds that they all learned something following the Russian fiasco in the summer. Mr. Yellow nods in understanding, and Squareguard continues how whichever of them is leading next year's games will need to organise original and engaging games, sometimes with little to no notice of issues which could affect these games. Mr. Orange scratches his neck, and Squareguard breathes out, bringing his hands back to the table. He then says how, on a more positive note, even though there were 1,001 things which could have gone wrong within this game, the three of them fulfilled their duties without any major setbacks. Mr. Yellow looks up as Squareguard announces that due to their collective success in today's game, along with the fact that one of their number is already out the running, he will not be eliminating anyone this evening. Whilst Mr. Yellow nods and quietly expresses his thanks, Miss Green lets out a loud sigh of relief. Yet Mr. Orange scoffs and asks why, with all due respect, Squareguard does not run these games by himself if he is so desperate to judge them. Miss Green lets out a gasp, then holds a hand to her mouth, and Mr. Yellow says that they should not be asking personal questions. However, Squareguard willingly answers how, although he applied to be the front man for these games, the powers that be decided he needed more experience of British customs before taking such a senior role in this country's games. A muffled cackle from the dormitory fills the resulting silence, and Squareguard declares that there are things he would change, though, if he were in charge next year. Mr. Orange looks down the line to Miss Green and gestures to Squareguard, whispering how he should be on this side of the table with them. Squareguard asks what Mr. Orange just said, to which he chuckles and replies that they are having lovely weather for this time of year. Squareguard faces Mr. Orange and looks ready to speak, when Mr. Yellow asks what Squareguard thinks should be changed in next year's games. Mr. Orange and Miss Green seem surprised by this question, but Squareguard takes a breath and answers that he would spend money on new buildings for different games. A spring of enthusiasm enters his voice when he mentions how a long track for Mr. Wolf would be great, as well as some sort of raised platform for hopscotch, a game with which he was unfamiliar until he came to Britain. Squareguard digresses how he would also like to host a larger number of players and use more team games, as these are his favourite types of games so far. Mr. Yellow nods, and Squareguard declares, however, that this is all very hypothetical either way. Mr. Orange suddenly gets up from his chair and says he knew they would not let him be eliminated, as he has been acing each game. He marches to the door and heads through without another word. Mr. Yellow turns to Squareguard and asks if they are allowed to leave. He responds that he guesses so, and dismisses Mr. Yellow and Miss Green. The latter gets up and hurries to leave the gallery, but Mr. Yellow remains seated and gives thanks again for this opportunity before taking his leave. Once Squareguard is alone in the gallery, he looks back to his painting of Van Gogh's self-portrait, which is sat on an easel overlooking the dormitory. Squareguard approaches and begins to draw in the eyes of Van Gogh, meticulously sketching each detail for the next few minutes, until he sees Mr. Orange casually strolling through the dormitory below. Although Squareguard looks back and continues sketching, he soon notices Mr. Orange, looking up to the gallery almost exactly to where he is standing. Squareguard continues to sketch, moving the pencil with brisker movements, until Mr. Orange appears to shake his head in amusement. He then calls to Miss Green, and she catches up, before walking onwards with him through the rows of beds. Squareguard abruptly stabs the pencil through the sketched eye, and lets out an angry grunt, followed by more wild groans as he repeatedly stabs the pencil through the paper. In the evening, the lights are turned back to their usual setting of brightness, and food bags are distributed to the players. Diane and Steve sit down to eat on the bed of player 97, and they speak about their lives as children, which appears to be an illuminating experience for them both. Steve is most surprised by the cost of Diane's school fees, whilst she struggles to believe that Steve's family could not afford to heat their home at times. Meanwhile, Colin approaches the Triangle guards on the platform and asks for the football. Miss Green looks to Mr. Orange, who nods and snaps his fingers at a circle guard. As this guard goes to retrieve the ball, Miss Green asks why Mr. Orange allowed this. He chuckles and answers that it will no doubt cause a fight, then tells Miss Green to wait and see. Within minutes, a game of football is being played in front of the platform between Richard, Colin, Johnny, Charlie, player 127, the older West African man, and after some reservations, player 53, the woman with the blonde quiff and chunky glasses. Although the conversation between Diane and Steve has been flowing up to this point, it begins to wane as the latter becomes distracted by the game of football. Diane seems somewhat confused, until player 127 narrowly misses the goal, and Steve exhales in second-hand annoyance. It is then that Diane turns and sees what Steve is watching. She rolls her eyes in amusement, and he finds himself standing up for a better view of the game. A joyous roar is then heard from the front of the dormitory. Diane looks round to see Colin running across the pitch, with his t-shirt over his head. He almost runs into Johnny, who shouts to watch where he is going, as Steve lets out a wholesome chuckle. Diane looks back and asks if Steve is going to join them. He slowly turns to her and replies that there will be an odd number with him. He looks back down to his food, and Diane is about to take another bite when she stops herself and suggests she plays as well in this case. Steve looks at her in bewilderment and replies that she does not play football. Diane gets to her feet and says there is a first time for everything. Steve's face travels through a range of expressions as she marches towards the game. He mutters to come back, but she is already out of earshot. Alan observes Diane with confusion as she passes him and reaches the pitch. A second later, a goal is scored by Johnny, and the ball is brought back to the centre. Before play resumes, Diane walks in with a smile and says she would like to join. This causes a few amazed looks between the players, including Richard and Johnny, who proceed to laugh. On the platform ahead, Mr. Orange sniggers to Miss Green to have a look. Richard marches over to Diane and snaps that they already have one girl playing. He juts a finger to player 53 and sneers how she is only here to make up the numbers. Diane says she has never played football and would like to try, but Richard shouts that he does not care. Johnny comments no offence, but she looks more suited to horse riding than football. He then asks if her father could not buy a horse for her, so she could ride around her estate and not have to witness the lowly peasants kicking their ball around the dirt paths of the village. Richard lets out an open laugh, and Johnny claims he is joking, but Diane is clearly annoyed. However, before she can object, Richard tells her to pass off. Her expression suddenly turns solemn, and she is about to do what has been asked, when Steve arrives next to her. He spouts that this is a disgusting way to talk to a woman, and tells Richard to apologise. Richard splutters with laughter and shouts at him to pass off as well. Steve immediately squares up to him, but Colin manages to get between the two men before any punches are thrown. The circle guards look ready to move in from the sides of the dormitory, but Mr. Orange subtly holds up a hand and they remain still. Colin works single-handedly to separate the two men, until Richard accidentally knees him in the side of the leg. As Colin shouts in pain, Richard steps back and apologises, although Colin replies that he needs to stop being such a carsehole. Richard apologises once more, and Colin limps away, saying that he needs to sit out for a few minutes. He gestures to Diane, who is still watching in surprise, and tells Richard to let her play in his place. Yet before Richard can object, Diane puts her hand on Steve's shoulder and tells him to play instead. He eyes her warily, but she whispers that he can always stop if he needs. She kisses him on the cheek and walks away to join Colin, who is now resting on the bed of player 6. Diane shoots Steve an assuring smile, then player 53 tells him to hurry up and get in defence for her and Charlie's team. Steve slowly approaches the goal and gulps as the ball is returned to midfield. Charlie takes the ball first, and he is almost tackled by Richard, but manages to pass the ball back to Steve. Johnny hurtles towards Steve, who briefly freezes, with vibrating hands and widened eyes. Player 53 shouts at Steve to move, and less than a second before he is about to be tackled, he gasps out, then swerves the ball round Johnny and hastily dribbles it towards midfield. Although player 53 shouts at Steve to pass to her on the other side of the pitch, he appears to be in his own world and clips the ball past Richard before smashing it towards the gap between the two chairs, which form the opposing team's goal. Player 127 jumps to block the ball, but narrowly misses and lands on the side of his knee, gasping in pain when the ball enters the goal. Steve stands with stunned pleasure as player 53 cheers, runs over, and pats him on the back. She shouts that this was an amazing goal, and Charlie nods respectfully from across the pitch. Still stunned into silence, Steve looks back to Diane, who bites her lip and grins at him from the bed of player 6. The match continues, with player 127 acting quickly to hide any pain his knee is causing him, and more players begin to watch from within the front row of beds. However, Tracy remains sat on her bed, where she is focused solely on her evening meal. She goes to grab more food from her pack, until she realises that it now contains only empty packaging. She begins to take short breaths and mutters to herself. This captures the attention of Alan, who watches her yank out every piece of rubbish from her pack. Just as Tracy looks around in despair, Alan takes out an apple from his discarded pack on the floor and offers it to her. She looks at him unsurely for a split second, but walks over and takes it. After biting into the apple and taking a few munches, Tracy thanks Alan. She is about to walk away when he responds that he doesn't like most fruit. Tracy takes another bite into the apple and turns to look into Alan's eyes. He seems fazed by the silence between them and comments how this has worked out well for them both. Tracy frowns and Alan sarcastically declares, "Everything happens for a reason." Tracy has to stop herself from snarling at this comment, and Alan explains that this is what his mother always says. Tracy exclaims how much she hates it when people say this. Alan seems taken aback by this response, but she asks what reason there is for her living on the streets for the last year, or for Alan having that disease, or for them being here. Alan looks down without an answer, and replies that he does not know. Tracy takes another bite of the apple, and says this is bullshit. She begins to walk away, but freezes, and turns to clarify how she does not mean to insult Alan's mother. He grins and responds that he does not care much about his mother's opinion these days anyway. Tracy lies back on her bed, and Alan ponders how maybe there is some bigger reason or higher power or spiritual shirt at play in their lives. Tracy jolts back and looks ready to reply, but holds her tongue. A few seconds later, she declares that nobody could tell her why anything happens the way it does in this forked up world. Alan lies back on his bed and shares how some good things at least have come into his life since it happened. He looks up to the ceiling and begins to peruse through several different thoughts. He presumes aloud that if he had not been infected, he would have found something else to complain about or forget to be grateful for. For nearly a minute he lists what these things could be, until he sits up and notices that Tracy's bed is now empty. Alan looks round and sees her walking towards the bathroom with a towel over her shoulder, eating a chocolate bar which is gripped firmly in her hand. Alan blows his nose again and looks into his pack to see that his chocolate bar is missing. At this moment, Tracy looks back, and upon seeing his reaction, she hurries onwards. Alan simply sniggers to himself, shakes his head, and lies back on his bed. Within a minute, he shivers as the cold sweat drips from his forehead. Meanwhile, at the other end of the dormitory, Nicholas observes the nearest players as he finishes his food pack. With Charlie playing football and Kelly asleep in her bed, the only other player awake in the vicinity is player 200, who is recreating the outer shell of an orange from its discarded peel. Nicholas gets up and ambles over to this corner of the dormitory. Player 200 notices him when he is just a few meters away, at which point she puts down the peel and meets his eye. With a charismatic smile, Nicholas says they have not properly met and puts out his hand, introducing himself by name. Player 200 cautiously shakes his hand and introduces herself as 200. Nicholas jokes that this is an interesting name, to which player 200 points at the number on her jacket and remarks how they must have them for a reason. Nicholas appears thoughtful, but accepting of this opinion, and he sits down on the bed of player 199. Player 200 watches him with a silent gaze, until he interrupts the silence, asking what she thinks they will be playing next. She winces, looks up to the nearest camera, and replies that she has no idea. She then turns back to Nicholas and voices how this whole place is kind of unpredictable. Nicholas nods and concedes to this point. With a cynical voice, he proceeds to joke that for all they know, they'll be dead before the next game. Player 200 narrows her eyes, and he explains how the old lady with glasses died in the night, before she was able to even try the game of conkers. Player 200 mutters, "True," and after another moment of silence, Nicholas suddenly asks if she would want to know when she dies. Nicholas hurries to explain that this may sound strange, but he would like to know what she would do if she only had a few days left to live. However, player 200 does not seem fazed, and answers that this will be the last night for most people here. Nicholas grins weakly, then without another word, player 200 gets up and heads to the bathroom. Almost an hour later, the lights of the dormitory are dimmed to their azure hue. The game of football comes to a friendly finish, and Diane and Steve head back to their beds. After having a quick check-in with Alan, Diane strolls onwards with Steve and states that she is utterly shattered from that game. Steve grins and asks how she could be shattered when she was only watching. Diane frowns and answers that it's still hard work to figure out all the silly rules. Steve laughs, and the pair arrive back at their beds. Diane sits on her own with a lazy smile and expresses how either way, It is nice to see that hunky smile Steve has been hiding. A mild beam of happiness shows across his face. Diane lies back on her bed and looks up calmly to the dulcet shade of the ceiling. She breathes serenely for almost a minute, until a shadow falls over her eyes. She jolts up to see Steve stood before her bed. She gasps that he just scared the life out of her. He does not move, but breathes deeply as he continues to regard her. Steve then sits on Diane's bed, and she looks up with a bewildered expression until he leans down and kisses her. She seems surprised, although she swiftly begins to resonate this intimacy. As the dormitory lights are dimmed to darkness, Steve takes Diane in both his hands. She then yanks off her jacket, and Steve starts to kiss along her neck. She exhales with more volume and runs her hands down Steve's chest, towards his trousers, when he stops her abruptly. Diane looks surprised, and Steve explains that he wants to keep going, but they should find somewhere more private. He offers to see if one of the bathrooms is empty, although Diane comments that this does not sound very romantic. Steve chuckles, and flippantly replies how they cannot do this here, as the whole room can hear them, even though he wants to have sex with her all night. Diane looks to him and he struggles to think of what else to say, until he blurts out that he wants to touch every single inch of her body and not stop shagging until they pass out. Through the darkness, Diane stares into Steve's eyes. He hurries to say that this was a weird thing to say, and begins to apologize when Diane holds up a finger to his lips. Steve seems exasperated and unable to find the right words, but Diane states that this is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to her. Steve stares back into Diane's eyes, and after she feels his body once more, he feels his hand up to the tip of her breast. She shudders and grinds her teeth. Steve asks if she is sure she wants to do this here, to which Diane immediately answers that they could be dead tomorrow. Steve smiles as she pushes him back onto her bed, exclaiming, "Fuck them all." He breathes out sharply, then relaxes as Diane pulls up his t-shirt before running her tongue down his chest and pulling off his trousers. Over the next few minutes, the couple discard any remaining clothes and enjoy each other's bodies. Several players begin to hear their sounds of pleasure, with player 127, the older West African man, kneeling by his bed to pray. Johnny smirks and shakes his head as he tries not to laugh, although Silver lies back in bed with closed eyes, and a serene smile soon forms across her face. An occasional catcall or shout of objection are heard through the darkness, but Diane and Steve appear too focused on each other to notice. For nearly 20 seconds, Squareguard watches them on a screen within the gallery. Upon seeing some guards debating taking action at the side of the dormitory, he takes out his radio and orders to let these two finish. Squareguard observes the variety of reactions from other players, along with the euphoria experienced by Diane. He laughs, then walks back to his desk and takes out a copy of Café Terrace at Night by Vincent van Gogh, which he attaches next to his easel. Squareguard begins to sketch in the outlines of tables and chairs, making sure he does not touch the easel's paper with too much force. After just 1 minute, a knock is heard at the door. He rushes to turn the easel away, then orders the knocker to come in. A circle guard enters with a small red box and informs that they have found what he was looking for.